ICEY is an action game developed by the Chinese indie group Shanghai Fantablade and was originally released on Steam in November of 2016. It's a hack and slash that's similar in vibe to Muramasa or Blood Rain Betrayal. You fight your way through hordes of enemies on a 2D plane, but ICEY tries to inject a little bit more personality into it by creating a meta-narrative with a self-aware narrator.
ICEY ignores the arrow. She doesn't notice the disturbing feeling hanging in the air.
I've never been a huge fan of using meta-narrative in games. The tongue-in-cheek humor that comes from fourth wall breaks or seemingly sentient NPCs is present in a lot of stuff though. But when you start to base your entire game around that self-awareness, you need to be ready to dig, or otherwise it'll start to get dull. The problem is that you can only do this type of thing once. The surprise of realizing you don't have to follow what you're told gets old very quickly. The most popular example of what I'm talking about here is the Stanley Parable, which is about the player meeting or going against the expectations of a narrator, and ICEY takes a very similar approach. In between machine slaughtering sessions, the narrator will wistfully chime in about how the titular robot girl, ICEY, is supposed to follow the on-screen flashing arrows to reach her next objective.
She understands that as long as she follows the arrow, she will discover where Judas is hiding. ICEY leaves the metro, following the arrow to Judas's hideout. ICEY follows the arrow as it winds through the clock tower. She knows Judas's hideout is just a little higher.
If you follow the narrator, you get a typical hack-and-slash action game with an annoying and repetitive story. If you choose not to follow the narrator, you get to delve a little deeper into some of the more odd things about the game's world. Most notably, you get some backstory to the monsters that you're up against. There's plenty of boss fights and other oddities locked behind a path less arrowed. Sometimes these things are kinda cool, like the game completely changing genres and turning into a platformer. But most of the time these sections just end up being hidden bosses or the narrator ranting at the player for a few minutes. The meta-narrative is a lot about the player expectations versus outcome, and it's hard to write around this because different players will choose different outcomes for different reasons. The narrator would commonly fall back on accusing me of screwing with him when I would choose not to follow along the path he lined out, but really I just enjoyed exploring the other areas I had access to. There's some interesting meta ideas here though. For one, the game goes through level select like you're running through an old computer, or I guess the mind of the ICEY robot girl. Actions are stored behind .bin and .exe files, which is an interesting and cool way to present this kind of stuff. It also makes sense when things start to go off the rails a bit because it's like you're accessing corrupted data or just checking out a different file. I really wish the game had pushed this simulation/level select deal harder with its wall breaks rather than try to rest simply on pointing out how you're breaking linear game conventions. Once you move this meta stuff out of the way, you're left with a somewhat average action game experience. ICEY has two sets of attacks, light and heavy. Every combo she uses revolves around these two buttons. It makes for great and simple combat, and there's a fine variety of options between your ground and air-based combos. It's very easy to get locked into a few certain moves as you progress though, since some attacks much outweigh others in terms of usefulness. While there are optimal combos, there are rarely optimal scenarios to use them in. ICEY doesn't play fair when it comes to defensive options. Blocking is non-existent outside of enemies that use it, and the dodge your character has is finicky at best. ICEY has a limited number of dashes she can use in and out of combat, and they recharge on a cooldown meter. You're not invulnerable during the start of a recovery animation of your dashes, so you can get hit by enemies at just about any time. The enemy AI can also combo you like you can them, but with much less finesse. It's easy to get stuck in knockdown loops off of screens of huge enemies, and even some bosses will easily throw you into attack spam that removes 50 to 80% of your life bar. There are a few counterbalances to deal with the punishing AI. The first is that ICEY heals off of every enemy she kills with a finishing move, which are always prompted for the player. The other main defensive option is doing a perfect dodge, but it's hard to determine when exactly you need to do these. Sometimes it's right before an attack would hit, and others it feels like when an enemy's attack animation starts, regardless of if you're in range of them or not. It's a little frustrating to deal with since these counters can also heal you. Overall though, the combat is fast-paced, but it lacks a level of polish in certain aspects, mostly your survivability. The boss fights are the real draw of the game, at least they were for me. Most of the fights come down to spacing and patience. You can counter with dash attacks like you can enemies, but with the finickiness of the counter, it's sometimes easier to just avoid attacks instead. You have to learn the windows each boss gives you for an attack because they can easily wipe your health bar out in a few seconds. What I enjoy most about these bosses is their designs though. You start out fighting large robots, but the closer you get to the end, the more monstrous and humanoid they begin to become. A lot of these things tie into the story hidden under the meta-narrative. There's an odd amount of Lovecraftian lore involved in the story, but it's not necessarily reflected in the game visually or atmospherically. Even though I love the colors and builds of the bosses, I wish they would reflect more of the strange and occult the farther in you get, because that's the story the game is pushing for. Overall, ICEY feels rather average. It's a pretty easy to pick up hack and slash, with its difficulty being tied to its limited defensive options and sometimes unforgiving AI. You'll need a good bit of patience to get through the last encounters just on how stupid the enemy spawns can get. The meta-narrative behind the game can lead to some interesting encounters and extras, but a lot of times it just ends up feeling like a preachy message on game design. ICEY is currently available on PSN for $15, but it came out on Steam almost a year ago for $10. The game is a bit on the short side if you're not into exploring, but uncovering every secret and extra boss presents a fun challenge, especially since some of the better fights are not ones you'd encounter by just doing what you're told.